Welcome to today's discussion on the Federalist and Anti-Federalist Papers, sponsored by the Principles of Freedom Foundation. The purpose of this foundation is to provide a platform for discussing the ideas pertaining to freedom, just as was done in the town squares, churches, and taverns during the founding era of this nation. Ideally, those who listen to or participate in this discussion will have come prepared by having read the materials to be discussed today. Participating in today's discussion are Tiffany and Tyler Mason, David Bishop, Julie Farnbach, and myself, Brooklyn McClure. We hope you will continue to participate in the discussion of freedom even beyond this podcast by commenting on our Facebook group, YouTube channel, and most importantly, by having continuous dialogue with your friends and neighbors. So today we are going to be discussing quite a few Federalist papers and Brutus's paper concerning taxes. So to start off, because there are a lot of different terms used in these papers, such as direct taxation, indirect taxation, external taxation, and internal, I wanted to refer to this book by Joseph Andrews. It's called A Guide for Learning and Teaching the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. And it's actually the outline for the Federalist Papers study that we've been doing. It's an excellent resource. You can learn the Constitution, the Declaration, the Federalist Papers all on your own by just following that book. You can find it on Amazon. So I'm going to share my screen because I wanted to bring up this image. So can you all see that? Can you see the image?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good.
Yep. Yep.
So for those who can't see it or who are listening, it's the Taxation Continuum that's found in Joseph Andrews's book. And on one side is involuntary, and then on the other side of this continuum is voluntary. And so it goes from the involuntary side being direct taxes and the voluntary side being donations. And then in between there on the continuum, you have internal taxes, indirect taxes, and external taxes. So does anyone want to explain kind of what some of these different taxes are? Like, what is a direct tax? What is an external tax, an indirect tax? I think we know what donations are, but.
I'd be happy to.
Okay.
I like to outline to understand relationships between concepts, and I love this continuum because even after I had read the definition of all of these different kind of taxes, it was still kind of a jumble in my mind. So if we look first at the center, indirect taxes, those are consumption or use taxes. Those are the things that are like sales tax or taxes that we pay to use a facility. These indirect taxes reward frugality, but they still allow extravagance. So they give you the freedom, that you give consumers the freedom to participate to whatever extent is best for their situation. So that's indirect taxes right there in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
To the right, the external taxes, such as the Sugar Act, those are taxes outside of the market of the United States. So those are import duties, tariffs, and taxes that are built into the cost of doing business for merchants coming to our shores to access broader markets. So those merchants being outside of the US bear the cost of those kinds of taxes, and they wrap that into their cost of doing business, but they are making the evaluation that I will pay this tax in order to have access to a bigger market for my products. And so that's an external tax. Then on the far left side, We have direct taxes, and that means we are directly taxing a person or a head of household for their income, for their property, buildings, land, for the number of people in the household, the number of children. That's a direct government intrusion into one individual's wallet, and it punishes success. It discourages growth, both in population and in business. So direct taxes have the effect, the impact on us as people of being punitive. And that's why the founding fathers said in their papers, in their writings that we read, that direct taxes were only appropriate in the event of an emergency or a war, because they believed themselves that this was inappropriate. They actually took the Stamp Act, which started the Boston Tea Party and propelled the revolution forward. They didn't see it as much as an indirect or consumption tax. They felt like it was a direct punitive tax because every family used used stamps, used paper. The Stamp Act is, I don't think, appropriately titled. It was really a tax on paper, the use of paper, and everyone then used paper. It was their only form of communication across, more than a room. So they felt that the Stamp Act was a direct tax to them. So the founding fathers were very motivated to avoid the use of direct taxes. And then to the right further, the last one that we skipped over is internal taxes. So that one's opposite of the external. So external taxes are taxes levied on people coming to our shores with their products. Internal taxes then are the opposite. They're the ones that are going to be levied on transactions happening on our shores, in our country, in our states, and in at that time, the Federation, and then into the United States. And internal taxes are taxes on the domestic economy. So any tax that would tax supplies, factories, mechanical machinery, things that the people would need to use to run their business, all of those are considered internal taxes. They support the government, but they are a drag on the economy, not as badly as direct or indirect taxes, but internal taxes needed to be minimized as well. So to review, the internal and external is outside of our shores, the source is outside of our shores, but they're coming to the US to do business and they pay for that privilege. Internal taxes are taxes on domestic economy, okay? Indirect taxes are, in a way, they're proportionally voluntary, meaning every family has to eat, every family has to go to the market and buy food, but it rewards frugality and allows extravagance so that every family can choose which foods to buy and how much, or which other goods to buy and how much. And then the worst of all, which are completely involuntary, and I think put us in a situation of serfdom rather than freedom. The direct tax is an actual government grabbing each person's wallet and taking from them their personal property through income tax, property tax, or head taxes. And that punishes success and discourages growth.
Thank you, Julie. That is a great explanation of all those. Did anybody want to add anything else to that? Can't see everyone's faces. Okay, so yeah, and I think it's important to note that the founding fathers' intent with the Constitution was, first of all, with the Articles of Confederation, it was to the far right when it came to taxation. They were literally asking for donations from each of the states to pay for the war debts and everything that they needed to pay for this new nation, this confederation. And that obviously wasn't working. So voluntary taxes don't work in our society. So they knew they had to change something in the Constitution, but as we'll read from Brutus and the Anti-Federalists were very much opposed to this because they pretty much feared what we have today. Actually, it was even more mild what they feared, and we've gotten way past what the founding fathers had intended, which is they intended for most of the country to be paid for by these external taxes, especially in times of peace. If there's a peacetime, all revenue would be generated from external taxes and some indirect taxes, so that the wealthy, if they wanted to pay sales tax and things, but if you were poor or middle class and you didn't want to put forth more money to the government, you didn't have to. You didn't have to go buy that thing or do that activity. And that all went pretty well until about 50 years before the Civil War. And then the safeguards that were built into the Constitution to protect us were eliminated in 1913 by the passage of the 16th Amendment, which authorized federal income tax. And so in some of these papers too, you'll read one of the fears was that there would be a double taxation on the people from the state and from federal. So does anyone have any comments, from the readings or just on the topic of taxes in general that you wanted to share, especially like how did we get from the origin of the founding fathers' vision to where we are now, and what can we do about it?
I have a quick question. You said 50 years before the Civil War. Did you mean the Civil War? You then
Civil War. Yeah,
okay.
so the nation existed with external taxes and revenues for about 50 years before the Wait, it says that in the book. Maybe it should be after. I was just reading from.
So the first 50 years as a country, it felt it was adequate, and then the Civil War destroyed
the Civil War. Sorry, that okay. Wasn't worded properly.
That's okay, and because the thing you said next was 1913, and those dates.
Yeah.
Actually, I have lots I can say, but one thing I want to point out, their concern about doubling up on the taxes was totally legitimate, but organizationally, Hamilton takes them to task a little bit about being worried about something that won't happen. And so the little quip I wanted to put forward is I have a daughter who's right now in her master's program in accounting so that she can qualify for the CPA exam and go on to support her family. And as it stands right now, and it has been ever since 1913 or immediately after that, the federal government had its own organizational structure, a department of the executive branch that handled federal taxes. And now it's the IRS post 1913, which is a government agency with some amount of independence, which is a whole other discussion. But anyway, the states each have their own administrative office to collect and disperse their own state taxes. So I kept going back and forth as I read Brutus and summarized Hamilton, and some of the arguments they make are legitimate, and some of them I think are made on the basis of assumptions or some confusion. So as always with all of this, I've been trying to find the truth in each side's argument, and sometimes they agree, and that's great, and sometimes they wander off into separate sets of assumptions that don't serve them well. So I just want to make that clear. They should have understood. I understand that they were afraid of losing state sovereignty, but what Brutus and Hamilton both said outright is that they should be relieved by the controls in the structure of the government, by the broad spread of the power and the vertical separation of power. And it's interesting that they both state that, but then they go on to argue opposite points of view based on that structure.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Tyler, did you have something?
Well, you just asked how did we get from there to here? And obviously we can't go through all of the details of what brought that about. But I think that to sum it all up, people like free stuff. They don't like the strings that are attached with free stuff, but they like free stuff. And so, you know, you look at a lot of the policies that have been created by a government that, Tiffany and I were having this conversation the other day. They missed the mark of, okay, we're going to protect three basic fundamental principles that Thomas Jefferson outlined in the Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is what a functioning government should be aiming to help to provide, but that's not their right or their responsibility to give us those things. And we're getting more and more and more to where, well, these people are underprivileged and they don't have an iPhone 12, so we're going to give them one. Who's paying for that? Well, don't ask that. They're just going to have one, and then we've leveled the playing field. Everybody now has a flagship smartphone. And this person, they have to take public transportation to work, so we're going to give them a car, right? That's the progression in the extreme of where it is that this is all gone, because, well, we'll just tax people and we'll make it all work. And for your lower class citizens, that sounds fantastic because they don't make the money to do it. They don't pay the taxes for it. And I think that's really where we've started to see this evolution of the government being like, well, we're obligated to, and here we are with, what are we at now? 13, 14, 15, what's our debt load right now in the United States? I can't even remember. I can't count that high.
I think it's more like 26 now. It's gone up a lot.
There we go, right? So
it's a slippage into socialism. I'm curious, this question just came to me when I was listening to you, Tyler. So Tyler and I taught the Civil War era to the school kids a few years ago. And because it was really that era, after that war, the whole makeup of this nation changed. And I just wonder, I just wondered while you're talking, if the outcome of that war had been different, you know, how different, obviously we might not be union anymore, but that seemed to change the mindset. It seemed to scare people so much that they, after that, willingly handed over a lot of freedoms to the federal government rather than retaining the state ones.
Douglas Gibbs, who we've mentioned before, mutual friend to most of us. David, I don't know if you had the opportunity to meet and work with Douglas Gibbs. He's a phenomenal guy. Abraham Lincoln is one of, I don't want to say it's his least, it's one of his least favorite presidents because of what happened during the galvanizing of our nation in creating the United States of America as we know it, where it was a galvanized structure. I understand why it was Lincoln had to do that. Was that the right way or the wrong way? I don't know, and I don't want to argue that point with anybody, but a lot of things did change in order for us to be able to win that war and then to re-accept the South back into a union. And so I think a lot of freedoms were given up under that. I think too, going to this idea of everybody likes free stuff and the government needs to provide. Suddenly we had how many millions of citizens who hadn't been citizens prior to the Emancipation Proclamation. And then, which amendment? The 16th?
16th was the income tax. 17th. Are you talking?
17th Amendment. No, I'm talking about the
Oh, sorry.
freeing of the slaves and making them all actual legal citizens, not just by
14th.
standards of war. 14th Amendment. Thank you, Julie. Right. So we had the Emancipation Proclamation to the 14th Amendment. All of a sudden we have what were once considered property, now considered citizens. Well, how do we account for all of that? How do we get them into society? How do we assist in that transition? And unfortunately, that transition took, I mean, Tiff, the book that you just read about the lawyer. Oh, it was a huge movie. If you all haven't seen it, help me out here.
Well, the movie's Just Mercy.
That's the one. So, you know, all the way into the 90s, where we're still trying to repeal some of these very heinous laws that were oppressive to minorities, undereducated, low socioeconomic conditioned individuals. You know, the Civil War was fought in the 1860s. Here we are 130, 140 years later, just barely starting to adjust some of that legislation that created this whole mess. And, you know, it's really easy to sit in the armchair of history and look back on it and be like, oh, well, this is where you guys all went wrong.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the point. But we do need to be able to look at that and see, okay, you know what? It kind of makes sense where we are because of decisions that were made in the past. And so let's make different ones now. Going to your question that you asked, Brooke, what do we do now to change it? Because obviously, I don't think any of us here had the ability to say, you know what, our $21 trillion debt, we're just going to wipe that out and start over. Like that's, so what do we do instead while we're being overly burdened by taxes that most people don't even recognize?
Yeah, those are some good points. And it makes me wonder, and we'll never know, you know, how might that reconstructive period after the Civil War even been different had Lincoln survived, because he had a totally different mindset towards forgiveness and reunification. And yeah, it's interesting to ponder. Did anybody else have something they wanted to add? Julie?
Oh, just quickly to answer Tyler's question, my strategy personally is to become as self-reliant as possible and deprive the government of an income to tax. I personally think, I'm not kidding. We have a family member who has made an active choice to work less in order to stay in a specific tax bracket. And just the fact that she finds that necessary for her own financial well-being really makes me angry. I personally don't have any hope that we, the people, can restrain our government at this point. And as Brutus and Hamilton both acknowledged, it's up to the people to police their representatives, because Congress will in fact not police itself. And they both stated that clearly too. Well, while Hamilton said that that's necessary, they have to have, because his point of view, and actually I think this is where my dislike of Hamilton sits, because he was too, in my view, he was too free with assuming that financial powers were safely given to government. And he wanted a Fed, and he wanted national banks. And I distrust that fundamentally. But coming from his upbringing, I don't blame him a bit for feeling that way. But back to my point, he recognized the deficiency of the Confederacy. He was acutely aware. He had served, he was Washington's aide de camp. He saw the men starving. He saw the results of those states not voluntarily funding the revolution. And he may not have personally had no boots and no blankets, but he was acutely aware of the fact that that lack of power caused untold human suffering and sacrifice. So I understand his perspective. I don't agree. I think he underestimates or he overestimates people's character and integrity over the long term. But Brutus makes good points when he refers to indirect, kind of between the lines. He's talking about human nature. He says, you know, you're giving Congress and I love this because he actually states it. He says, you're giving them unlimited power to weigh and levy taxes, and you're also giving them a necessary and proper clause and the general welfare. He actually, I thought this was a modern invention, but Brutus actually said that they will abuse that necessary and proper clause, that they will extend spending to whatever they deem necessary. And he even goes to the point of, in the detail, and I didn't realize that, he said any tax is going to, oh no, that was Making of America. That was Skousen. Anyway, he was saying any opportunity to tax is going to necessarily create a new regulatory system below it, which will necessarily create permitting and licensing requirements, which will necessarily tax those businesses to the point of choosing the winners and losers in the marketplace. So he's saying, Skousen says in Making of America, every time you create a new tax, you are actually picking the winners and losers, and you are creating additional drag on the economy.
Mhm.
So while I appreciate Hamilton and everybody else's need to avoid the tragedies of the Confederate system, Brutus is absolutely correct in pointing out that this Constitution, as it's worded, will depend on the integrity of the people, and that will ultimately fail us. I think Brutus was a little educated than Hamilton.
And to go on something that Julie said at the start of that, a point that you made for politicians policing themselves. Again, this is a conversation we've been talking a lot about here in our home. It's really easy to talk big, right? We're all sitting here and we're discussing the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist Papers, and we're studying the Constitution and trying to get inside the minds and the experiences of these individuals that framed the country that we live in. What are we doing with it? You know, how does that translate into our lives? You know, are we paying attention to the voting records of those that are in office? Are we getting involved with our neighbors to the point where we're able to have conversations about, this is what's relevant to where we live? This is how we will be impacted. You know, there's legislation all over the country right now dealing with gun law. President Biden, he said that, you know, he wants, how did he phrase it? A common sense gun law, right? Which sounds fantastic on the surface. Oh yeah, common sense, right? But then you start looking at, what does that mean? And it's coming after, you know, your ability, not just for assault weapons, whether or not you agree with those or disagree with those. It's coming after your ability to be able to buy ammunition over the counter without having to have a federal background check for it. It's the tracking and tracing of who has what, potentially taxes. So, you know, the same way that I have to license my automobile every year, I'm going to have to license my firearms. And so here in Missouri, we're passing a Second Amendment, or we're attempting to pass a Second Amendment Protection Act, which I think is ludicrous that I have to pass legislation to protect a right that's already mine. But here we are, right? So I think that's probably the big takeaway from this whole thing is, okay, so here we are. Now what? How do I fight it? We're not going to fight it at the federal level. We're just not. Fight it at your local level and let it work its way up.
I would love to say that I have any faith in that ability. to fight it at the local level, having just spent 6 years learning the hard way that I can't. So let me, I know I've already said more than my share, but really quickly. Once you are familiar, thoroughly familiar with the needs of your local community, you will happily accept any money sent to you by the county or the state or the federal government because you will want to help meet those needs. Now, when I first ran for the school board, Common Core was a new thing, and I was firmly against it and thought it was bad policy, politically, financially, and from a curriculum standpoint. And I thought that running for the school board, I could help fight it. Well, I had no idea how the whole system works. But I asked the superintendent at that time, I said, well, how much money did you get for accepting Common Core? And he quoted me the number, it was 5 million and change. And I said, well, then can we give it back, please, and not take Common Core? And he looked at me like I had lobsters crawling out of my ears, to quote one of my favorite movies. There are so many needs that they cannot meet with their current budget that the school board, the city council, whoever it is, will always want more to meet more of those needs. And I voted to be happy about how to spend more. And I know that in the past, we've sought bond measures to pay for things. And in the future, they will continue to ask for bond measures just to try to close the gap between needs and funding. So that I know that's obnoxious and it's not 100% faithless, but it's not nearly as simple to produce as it sounds in theory.
Well, and Julie, I genuinely appreciate the lengths that you have gone to try and correct an education system in a sinking state. I really like the fact that you even put yourself in that position. It's got to be like banging your head against the wall every single day. I totally understand that.
Every other day.
Okay, every other day. There's some good days in there. But, you know, when we consider what it takes to make grassroots change, right? And it sounds so simplistic in nature, and I understand that it's not. But I think what it takes for that is, like, how big is Temecula School District? How many students do y'all serve?
6 years ago, it was 30,000. Now it's more, well, pre-COVID, it was 27,000. I couldn't give you a number now. It's more like 26.
Okay, right. But you're talking about making change with 27,000 students. How many families does that translate to, right? What sort of a geographical area? And again, we're introducing into it economics and education and all of these different factors. But if you can just start with meeting your neighbor. So this is one thing that blew my mind when I first started doing sales door to door. I'd knock on a door. I'd talk to somebody, have a conversation with him. I would walk next door and I'd say, hey, I just talked with Pat, your neighbor. And they're like, oh yeah, I don't know who that is. Well, they've lived here for the last 15 years. I've been here for the same amount of time. We moved in the same weekend, but we've never met, right? We're so disassociated as a society. It's like, well, let's just start with that. Let's not talk about full policy governmental reform here. Let's just talk about reforming our neighborhoods. Let's take that back so that we can actually have a conversation with people and say, hey, look, you know what? There's this bond that's going to be passed. What do you think about it? And not turn it into a fist fight. And, you know, but we just need to grow up a little bit, cool down a little bit. And I think that's where it has to start. But I don't want to underplay how complex that still is. But I think that's the only way we can have faith in change. Because otherwise it's this big ball of wax and there's no way.
Right. I don't want to discourage anybody from ever trying, but I feel like I've got 2 or 3 books I need to write to explain that it's not as simple as anybody thinks. And it's always going to be slow. That was in Making of America too, or was that in Andrews? Congress is supposed to be slow at accomplishing things. And it's supposed to be gridlock most of the time because we only want things that are widely supported broadly supported across all ideal perspectives to be actually implemented.
Okay, so both of you kind of lead into this last question that I wanted to present, and we discussed it a little bit on our private chat group throughout the week. And it's Brutus. He says that at the very beginning of Essay 6, a simple free government could not be exercised over this whole continent. This whole continent at that time being 13 states. He thought there's no way that a simple government can be exercised over that, and that therefore we must either give up our liberties and submit to an arbitrary one, or frame a constitution on the plan of confederation. So he's arguing, keep it the confederation. We sent you to this Continental Congress to revise the Articles of Confederation. You totally hoodwinked us. Now we have a whole new government, and this is unacceptable. So I do wonder, though, because we were discussing this, is the Constitution right now outdated? Or what's your opinion on that? That's a huge question right now out in the media, and for all Americans, a lot of people think it's outdated, and that there's nothing we can do about it. Some people know we need to hold on to it the way it is. What are your thoughts there?
Okay, I'll go. I was giving somebody else an opportunity. So again, conversation in our house that we had this weekend, and for anybody, Brooke, you encourage people at the beginning of each of these episodes, talk about this stuff at home, right? This is what we do. This is our conversation at home. And so we were talking about just how well the founding fathers understood human nature. It's almost scary how well they understood human nature, because as you start to understand the core of what they're talking about, is the Constitution outdated? Absolutely not. It's more relevant now than it was when they wrote it, if that's even possible to believe. Are the people out of touch with what the Constitution is, what it means, how it impacts their lives on a daily basis? Absolutely. So I think that really for our Constitution to continue to function, and we've beat this horse to death, people need to understand what's in it and what it means. If we don't, my fear is that we're going to be looking at the dystopian novels that I enjoy reading and the conspiracy theory, not conspiracy theory is the wrong word, the war game projections for what our country looks like as we end up torn into somewhere between 4 and 6 different Confederate states, essentially, at that point, because we can't get along anymore.
Reminds me of that meme, make 1984 fiction again. I feel the same way about Fahrenheit 451. I'm like, wow, I used to think this was a fictional book, but we're quite living that. Okay, so yeah, I agree. Did anyone else have anything else to say before I give my opinion on the subject?
I do, but I'm trying to wait for Tiffany and David to have a turn.
Well, I don't know. Me and Tyler, I just asked that question, I think, to Tyler yesterday. And it's been interesting. We spend a lot of our time talking on this limit of powers of taxation and basically the general welfare. And I put it in quotations because that's what we're taxing things on now, instead of the enumerated powers that they were originally supposed to be taxing on. We switched over to this, well, as long as it's for the general welfare, and then we get these special interest groups and all of these different taxes now, to basically where I think it was in 1936, Justice Roberts basically opened up the confines that general welfare can mean whatever they want it to mean. So is it outdated, or have we just interpreted it and changed it so much that it's not being used the way it was written? And that's more what my concern is that it's just been interpreted so many times by so many people that we're not even using it the way the founding fathers intended it for it to be used.
Exactly. Thank you.
so my mind is like somewhere else right now. I'm thinking of a comment that you'd made, Julie, about experience. You talk about Madison. You know, he knew so much through experience that we almost expect him to know everything. You know, and I think my job, I'm a project manager, which means I know nothing. It means I have to connect everyone who knows something, and somehow I have to enlarge my experience in ways to be able to come up with plans that are successful or that we progress together. Somehow my job is about unity. How do I bring together people from Israel, Ireland, Switzerland, California, Chicago, who have different views of the world, different expertise, and how do I bring them to meet some sort of objective together, when the tendency is to minimize what others have to do and maximize, oh, mine is the hardest. And to be in the middle of that, oh, what do I, you know, how do I do that? And how do I'm finding that knowing is something that's is impossible to do for me without God, actually. And I love how scriptures talk about how the words of God enlarge the memories of the people. And so my mind's in that area somewhere saying, well, how do we make a difference? Well, I feel like these processes, it's somehow in uniting one by one, and even these small groups starts to make some difference. And so if we can increase in love, we increase in knowledge, and then we increase in freedom. Even if it's in my heart right here that I'm, okay, the government's taking my money, and yet I'm not a slave.
Thank you, David. That reminds me of Viktor Frankl too, being in the concentration camps. You know, talk about having your freedom taken. He almost had his life taken, and yet he maintained that personal peace through God, through that experience. So that is our choice. Okay, so I want to tie together kind of everything we've said and touch a little bit on Tiffany's, and maybe end with that rhetorical question for ourselves and everyone who's listening, to just ponder, because Tiffany talked about, you know, we need more education on this document and et cetera, et cetera. But my question is, do the people really want a republic still? Or do they want socialism? And is that even up to the people? I love Douglas Gibbs came and spoke at our private school last week, and he, you know, usually we're like, oh, it's the representative's job to listen to the voice of their people, and, you know, whatever the voice of their people saying, that's what they follow. And he's like, no, what you do as a representative who's educated in these true principles and who swears by an oath to uphold the Constitution is you do right in supporting the Republic and in defending the Constitution. Even if you have a majority of your voters, your constituents yelling at you to adopt something that's opposite of a constitutional republic, you do not bow to that voice. I mean, that's the proper way to be a representative according to constitutional principles, according to what this country was based on. Now, some people might argue and say, no, we need this free thing and this free thing. It's like, okay, well, that mechanism was built into the Constitution as well to make amendments and to change the government. But if we're going to do that, let's do it in a proper way. Let's do it constitutionally. Change this thing instead of, I mean, the last war to be declared constitutionally was World War II, I believe. All the wars since World War II have not been declared through the two houses of the legislature like it's supposed to. And that's just to name one of the parts of the Constitution that's not being followed. So my question is, okay, do we want this Constitution or not? Do we want the Republic or not? If we don't, let's go about it in the proper way. But if we do, let's go about it in the proper way as well. But I think we find ourselves in this nation in this limbo where we call it a constitutional republic, but we're living in socialism. And we call it capitalism, but it's really socialism. So some of the problems that we're having, you're blaming on capitalism, but it's really socialism, you know? So we're in this just quandary again, because we're not educated. So just something to ponder, like what do you want? Do you really want a republic? And are you doing what that would require, which is a lot of self-government? Or do you truly in your heart want socialism? Maybe that's, and I think being honest with ourselves, and like David, you know, suggested, the only way to really come to these right answers is by going to God or your higher power and receiving that. So thank you for this discussion. It's been thought-provoking as usual, and we'll see you next time.